Some places don't wait to be found, they wait for the right person to arrive. The first time the floor moved, Caleb Mercer thought it was just the wind pressing against the old wood, the kind of slow, restless breath that slipped through cracks in forgotten places. But Ranger knew better. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his body going still in a way Caleb had learned never to ignore. And then came the second tremor, faint but steady beneath his boots. A pulse that didn't belong to the forest or the cold November air. Something deeper, something hidden, and the cabin around them seemed to listen, its beams creaking softly as if remembering a story no one had told in years. Caleb exhaled slowly, his breath turning to fog in the dim light filtering through the narrow window. The smell of pine, dust, and old time wrapping around him like a memory he couldn't quite place. He hadn't come here looking for anything, not answers, not purpose, just distance. Miles and miles of quiet between him and the things he couldn't forget, the gravel road that led to. This place had stretched for nearly 12 miles without a single sign of life, just trees and silence and the low hum of tires against dirt. And when the cabin finally appeared at the edge of the clearing, it looked less like a home and more like something the earth had decided not to swallow. Leaning slightly, weathered gray, its roof sagging under years of snow and seasons no one had bothered to count. Ranger had stepped out of the truck first, paws pressing into the frost-covered ground, nose lifting as if catching a scent carried from somewhere beneath the surface. Caleb remembered the way the dog paused, just for a second, staring at the cabin like it was staring back. And that was before he met the old man, Walter Hayes, who had been standing in the doorway without a sound, as if he had always been there, waiting, his frame thin but steady, wrapped in a worn flannel jacket, his eyes sharp in a way that didn't match his age. "You're late," the man had said, not unkindly but certain, like he wasn't guessing, like he knew. And Caleb had frowned, glancing behind him at the empty road stretching back through the trees. "I didn't know anyone was expecting me," he replied, but Walter only gave a small nod, stepping aside, the door creaking open just enough to invite him in. "Some things take time to arrive," he said quietly, and Ranger moved first, padding across the threshold, nails clicking softly against the wooden floor before stopping dead in the center of the room, his head lowering, ears twitching, listening to something Caleb still couldn't hear. And that's when it came again, the faint, steady vibration beneath the floorboards, once, then silence, then again, and Caleb felt it this time, not just in his feet, but in his chest, like an echo of something buried long before he ever set foot in that place. He crouched slowly, pressing his hand against the cold wood, counting without realizing he was doing it. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 27, and then the pulse returned, exactly the same, precise, deliberate, as if something below was keeping time. And behind him, the old man's voice drifted through the stillness. Softer now, almost like a memory. It only does that when someone finally listens. Caleb did not answer right away, his hand still pressed against the cold wood as the rhythm continued beneath his palm, steady and deliberate. And for a moment, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Not fear, not exactly, but recognition, like hearing a distant echo of a place he had once known but could no longer name. Ranger let out a low breath and shifted closer, his body angled toward the center of the room, eyes fixed on the floor as if waiting for it to speak again. The fire in the small iron stove crackled softly, filling the cabin with a thin warmth that did little to chase away the deeper chill that seemed to live in the walls. Caleb rose slowly, brushing dust from his hands, his gaze moving across the room, taking in details he had missed before. The beams above were carved in places, faint markings worn by time, but too deliberate to be random. Lines and symbols etched into the grain, as if someone had tried to leave behind a message that did not belong to words. "How long has it been doing that?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but low. Walter did not turn to face him right away. The old man stood near the window, looking out at the line of trees swaying gently under the gray sky. "Long enough," he said after a moment. "But it does not always answer." Caleb frowned slightly, stepping closer. "Answer what?" Walter's reflection in the glass seemed older than the man himself, thinner somehow, as if time had pressed harder on him than it should have. "People," he said simply, and then he turned, his eyes meeting Caleb's with a calm that felt almost unsettling, not because it was strange, but because it was certain. It listens first, he added, and Ranger gave a soft whine, pawing once at the floor before stopping, as if he understood something Caleb did not. The room fell quiet again, the kind of silence that did not feel empty, but full, like it was holding something just out of reach. Caleb exhaled and glanced toward the door, the thought of leaving flickering briefly in his mind. But it did not stay. It never did anymore, not since he had started running without knowing where he was going. "You need help with the roof," he said instead, shifting the moment into something solid, something he could hold. Walter's expression softened just slightly, a hint of something like relief. "Passing through it. It leaks when the snow melts," he replied, and Caleb nodded once. Already moving toward his pack, the familiar weight of tools grounding him in a way nothing else could, Ranger stayed where he was for a second longer, watching the floor, listening, then finally followed, though his ears never fully relaxed. Outside, the air was sharp and clean, stretching wide across the clearing. The cabin behind them standing quiet against the trees, but even out there, Caleb could not shake the feeling that whatever lay beneath it had not stopped. It had only grown quieter, waiting. And as he climbed the short ladder to the roof, hammer in hand, he realized something he had not expected. He was not here by accident, not entirely. The road, the silence, the old man at the door, the way Ranger had stopped at the threshold. All of it felt less like coincidence and more like a path he had stepped onto without noticing. And somewhere beneath the boards, counting in a rhythm older than his memories, something continued to keep time, patient and unchanged, as if it had always known he would eventually arrive. The sound of the hammer echoed softly across the clearing, each strike steady and measured, but beneath it Caleb could still feel that other rhythm, faint yet persistent, like a second heartbeat layered under the work of his hands, and every few moments he would pause without realizing it, listening, counting, waiting for the pulse to return. Ranger stayed below at the edge of the cabin, pacing in slow circles, his nose lifting toward the air and then dropping back to the ground, drawn again and again to the same invisible point beneath the structure, his tail low but not afraid, focused, as if he were following instructions only he could hear. The sky above stretched pale and distant, clouds drifting in long quiet bands that cast moving shadows over the trees, and for a while it almost felt normal, like any other repair job in any other forgotten place. But that feeling never fully settled. It hovered just out of reach, interrupted each time the unseen rhythm returned, steady as a clock no one could see. Caleb drove another nail into the weathered wood and leaned back slightly, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, his breath steady, his movements practiced, and yet his mind kept circling back to the same thought. Why here? Why now? He had passed a dozen roads before turning onto this one, a dozen chances to keep going, and still he had stopped, as if something had quietly guided him without asking permission. Below him, the cabin door creaked open and Walter stepped out slowly, carrying a small metal thermos. The old man's gaze lifted toward Caleb with a calm that had not changed. "You work like someone who has done this before," he said, his voice carrying easily through the still air. Caleb gave a slight nod, tapping the hammer lightly against the wood. "Built things, fixed things, sometimes both," he replied, and Walter walked a few steps closer, setting the thermos on the ground near the porch. Ranger immediately moved toward him, sniffing once, before sitting beside the old man as if accepting him without question. "And did it help?" Walter asked after a moment, and Caleb paused, his grip tightening just slightly around the handle of the hammer. He looked out past the trees, past the clearing, to where the road disappeared into distance. "It kept things from falling apart," he said finally, and Walter nodded, as if that answer was enough, or perhaps more than enough. The wind shifted gently, carrying the scent of pine and something colder, something older, and Ranger suddenly stood, ears snapping forward, his body going still again. Caleb felt it a second later, the vibration returning beneath his boots even through the roof. Faint but unmistakable, he froze, listening, counting without thinking, 1, 2, 3, until 27, and there it was again, precise, unchanging. Walter did not react, not outwardly, but his eyes closed briefly, as if he were acknowledging something familiar, something expected. It is stronger today, he murmured, almost to himself. Caleb climbed down from the roof without rushing, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, and he walked toward the center of the cabin floor just inside the doorway. Ranger already there, waiting, his paw resting lightly on the wood as if marking the exact spot. Caleb crouched slowly, pressing his hand against the boards once more. The pulse met him instantly this time. Steady, deliberate, no longer faint. And for the first time, he felt something else beneath it. Not just movement, but intention, as if whatever lay below was no longer just waiting, but recognizing, and behind him, Walter's voice came again, softer now, almost like a memory carried on the wind. It has not done that in years. Caleb did not pull his hand away this time. Even as the pulse pressed steadily into his palm, no longer faint, no longer distant, it felt closer now, almost as if the space between him and whatever lay beneath the floor had thinned. Ranger shifted beside him, lowering his head until his nose nearly touched the wood, a soft breath escaping him. Not a warning, not fear, but recognition. And Caleb felt something inside his chest tighten in a way he could not explain. Not panic, not confusion, but the quiet weight of something aligning, like a piece of a puzzle he did not know he had been carrying. He lifted his gaze slowly toward Walter, who stood just behind him, the old man's posture calm but no longer distant. There was something different in his eyes now, something settled, as if a question had finally been answered without needing to be asked. "What is it?" Caleb said, his voice low but steady, and for a moment Walter did not speak. The wind moved softly outside, brushing against the cabin walls, the trees whispering in long, slow breaths, and then the old man stepped forward, his boots creaking lightly against the worn floorboards. "Not what?" he said quietly. "Who?" And Caleb frowned slightly, the words settling in the air between them, heavier than it should have been. "Who?" he repeated, and Walter nodded once, his gaze drifting briefly to the floor before returning to Caleb. "It does not answer to everyone," he said. "Most people never hear it at all." Ranger gave a small movement, pressing his palm more firmly against the wood, as if confirming the exact place, and Caleb glanced down again, feeling the rhythm continue, precise, unwavering, the same 27-second interval, like a signal that refused to fade. "And you have known about this the whole time?" Caleb asked, and Walter's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, long enough to understand that it was never mine. He replied, the words quiet but certain. Caleb straightened slowly, his hand finally lifting from the floor, though the sensation lingered in his palm, as if the rhythm had left an imprint behind. He took a step back, his mind trying to make sense of something that did not follow any pattern he trusted. "Then why stay here?" he asked, and Walter looked around the cabin, at the walls, the beams, the worn edges of a life lived in quiet waiting. "Because some things are not meant to be found quickly," he said. "They are meant to be waited for." The words settled into the space like dust catching light, and Caleb felt them more than he understood them. Outside, a faint shift in the air carried the distant sound of branches moving, the day slowly leaning toward evening. But inside the cabin, time felt different, slower, stretched between each pulse beneath the floor. Ranger suddenly let out a soft, short sound, drawing Caleb's attention back down. The dog stepped back slightly, then looked up at him, his amber eyes clear, focused, expectant, and Caleb felt it then, not just the rhythm, not just the presence beneath the wood, but the pull, subtle but undeniable, like a door that had been closed for years quietly beginning to open. Walter watched him without speaking, his expression calm, patient, as if he had already seen this moment before, not with Caleb specifically, but with someone, sometime, and Caleb took a slow breath, his gaze returning to the exact spot where Ranger had been pointing, the boards worn but intact, nothing outwardly unusual, and yet everything about it felt different now. "If it is not yours," Caleb said quietly, "then why does it feel like it is waiting for me?" Walter's eyes softened, just slightly, and when he answered, his voice carried no doubt at all. "Because it is." Caleb stood there for a long moment without moving, the words settling into him in a way that felt less like understanding and more like recognition, as if something deep inside him had already known the answer before it was spoken. The cabin seemed quieter now, not because the sound beneath the floor had stopped, but because it no longer felt hidden. It felt present, acknowledged, like a conversation that had finally begun. Ranger stepped forward again, slower this time, his nose brushing the wood before he gently tapped the same spot twice with his paw, then looked up at Caleb, waiting, always waiting for him to catch up, and Caleb exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as if trying to clear a thought that would not leave. "I do not understand any of this," he admitted, his voice steady but honest, and Walter gave a small nod, as if that was exactly where he expected him to be. "You are not supposed to," the old man replied, his tone calm. "Not yet." The wind pressed lightly against the cabin walls, carrying with it the scent of the coming cold, the kind that settled into bones and stayed there, and Caleb felt that same quiet weight in his chest again. But this time it was not something he wanted to push away. It was something he wanted to follow. Even if he could not explain why, he crouched once more, slower now, more deliberate, his fingers tracing along the grain of the floorboards until they reached the exact place Ranger had marked. The wood there felt no different than the rest, worn, aged, solid, but the rhythm beneath it was unmistakable, steady as breath, and he pressed his palm down again, letting the pulse meet him, counting without thinking, 1, 3, all the way to 27, and then again and again, each cycle drawing him further into a quiet focus that pushed everything else away, the past, the road, the reasons he had kept moving for so long. All of it faded into the background, leaving only this moment, this place, this steady signal rising from somewhere below. "There is something under here," he said finally, not as a question, but as a statement, and Walter's eyes softened just slightly. "Yes," he said. "There always has been." Caleb lifted his gaze, searching the old man's face for something more, something clearer, but Walter did not offer it, not directly. Instead, he turned slightly and walked toward a narrow shelf near the wall, reaching for something Caleb had not noticed before, a small, rusted tool, its handle worn smooth with age. He held it for a moment, almost thoughtfully, before bringing it back and placing it gently in Caleb's hand. The metal was cold, heavier than it looked. "I thought it might be you," Walter said quietly, and Caleb looked down at the tool, then back at the floor, the weight of the moment settling in around him. Ranger sat back on his haunches now, watching closely, his ears forward, his entire posture focused, and Caleb tightened his grip slightly, the decision forming not as a sudden impulse, but as something that had been building since the moment he turned onto that long, empty road. He positioned the edge of the tool against the seam of the board, hesitating for just a second as the pulse beneath his hand returned again. Steady, patient, almost expectant, and then he pressed down, the wood giving slightly with a soft creak, not breaking, but shifting, as if it had been waiting for that exact pressure, that exact moment, and somewhere beneath the floor, the rhythm did not stop. It grew just a fraction stronger, like something below had felt the first sign that the surface above was finally beginning to open. The wood did not break the way Caleb expected. It did not splinter or crack under pressure. Instead, it shifted with a quiet resistance, like something held in place for a very long time finally allowing itself to move. And as the edge of the tool sank deeper into the seam, the pulse beneath his hand grew clearer, no longer distant or muffled, but present, as if the space between them had thinned even further. Ranger leaned in closer, his nose nearly touching the opening as it widened by an inch. Then another, his breathing slow but focused, his entire body still except for the slight flick of his ears with each returning rhythm. Caleb adjusted his grip and pressed again, the board lifting just enough to reveal a narrow line of darkness beneath, not empty, not silent, but alive with that same steady interval. He paused there, holding the position, feeling the air shift upward through the opening, cooler than the room, carrying with it a faint metallic scent mixed with something older, like stone that had not seen light in decades. Behind him, Walter did not move, did not speak, his presence quiet but grounded, as if this moment did not belong to him anymore. And Caleb understood that without needing it explained, this was not something being shown to him. This was something being given, slowly, carefully. In its own time, he lowered himself further, setting the tool aside for a moment as he slid his fingers into the gap, the wood cool against his skin, the space beneath just wide enough to feel, but not yet to see. And then the pulse came again, directly beneath his hand now. Unmistakable, steady, patient, and Caleb felt it differently this time. Not as a vibration in the floor, but as something reaching back, not physically, but intentionally, like a signal answering a call that had finally been understood. He drew in a slow breath, his chest tightening not with fear, but with the weight of something real, something that did not need explanation to be true. Ranger let out a soft sound, shifting slightly to the side as if making space, and Caleb glanced at him briefly, the dog's eyes steady, unwavering, as if he had known this moment would come long before Caleb ever stepped into the clearing. The board lifted another fraction under Caleb's grip, enough now for a sliver of shadow to reveal itself beneath. Not empty darkness, but depth, layered and still, and somewhere within it, the rhythm continued, unchanged, 27 seconds, precise, deliberate. Caleb's fingers brushed against something below, not wood, not dirt, but metal, smooth and cold, and he froze for a second, his hand resting there as the pulse moved through it again, stronger now, clearer, and with it came a strange sense of familiarity. Not memory exactly, but something close, like standing in a place that felt known even when it should not. He slowly withdrew his hand, sitting back on his heels, his eyes fixed on the narrow opening as his mind tried to catch up to what his instincts had already accepted. "There is something down there," he said quietly, more to himself than to Walter, and the old man's voice came gently from behind him, steady and certain. "Yes," he said, "and it has been waiting longer than either of us." The wind outside shifted again, brushing softly against the cabin walls, and inside. The space between each pulse seemed shorter now, not because the timing had changed, but because Caleb was no longer measuring it. He was feeling it, and as he reached once more for the edge of the board, ready to lift it further, he understood something without needing words. Whatever lay beneath that floor had not just been waiting to be found. It had been waiting for him to be ready to see it. Caleb tightened his grip along the edge of the loosened board and pulled with a slow, steady motion, the wood lifting inch by inch as if resisting not out of strength, but out of time, like something that had simply grown used to being closed. And as the gap widened, the darkness beneath it shifted into something more defined, not empty, but layered, a shallow chamber just below the floor, its edges lined with aged stone that did not match the cabin above. Ranger stepped back slightly, then circled once before settling beside Caleb again, his gaze fixed on the opening, his breathing calm but attentive. The rhythm continued, steady and unchanged, but now it seemed to rise more clearly through the space, no longer muffled by the barrier of wood. Caleb set the board aside carefully, revealing a rectangular opening no wider than 2 feet across, just enough to reach into but not yet enough to fully see. He leaned forward, resting one hand on the floor as he angled his body to look. Inside, the light from the cabin stretched only a short distance into the space below, catching the faint outline of something metallic resting at the center, smooth and still, its surface reflecting just enough light to confirm its presence without revealing its full shape. Caleb's breath slowed as he stared, the sense of familiarity returning stronger now, not as a thought, but as a feeling, like standing in a place where something important had once happened. Even if he could not remember it, he reached down again, more certain this time, his fingers brushing against the metal surface. It was cold, but not lifeless, and as the next pulse came, it traveled through it, up his hand, into his arm, and settled somewhere deep in his chest. Not painful, not overwhelming, just present, and for the first time, Caleb understood that the rhythm was not coming from the space itself. It was coming from whatever rested within it. He withdrew his hand slowly, sitting back again, his eyes fixed on the opening as his mind worked to catch up to what his instincts had already accepted. "It is not just something buried," he said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet certainty now, and Walter stepped closer, stopping just behind him, his gaze lowered into the opening with a calm that did not waver. "No," the old man replied. "It is something left behind." The words settled differently, heavier, more deliberate. Caleb glanced back at him briefly, searching for more, but Walter only nodded toward the opening, as if the answer was already there waiting. Ranger shifted again, this time lowering his head toward Caleb's shoulder, a quiet presence, steady and grounding. And Caleb took a slow breath before leaning forward once more, this time committing fully, his arms sliding into the space until his hand found the edge of the object. It was a box, small enough to lift, but heavier than it should have been, its surface worn but intact, and as he wrapped his fingers around it, the rhythm paused for the first time, just for a second, long enough to be noticed, and then returned, stronger, clearer, like a signal that had finally been received. Caleb hesitated only briefly before lifting it slowly from the chamber, the weight settling into his hands as he brought it into the light, the metal catching the glow from the window, revealing a surface marked with faint engravings, worn but deliberate, symbols that looked familiar in a way he could not immediately place. And as he held it there, just above the open floor, the cabin around him seemed to grow still, the wind outside quieting, the air inside holding steady, as if everything had been waiting for this exact moment. And behind him, Walter spoke again, his voice softer now, almost like it belonged to the past rather than the present. "Some things are not meant to be found," he said, "until the person they belong to is ready to carry them." Caleb held the box in both hands, its weight settling into him in a way that felt far heavier than metal alone, the engraved surface catching the dim light, revealing faint lines that seemed almost worn by touch rather than time. Ranger stepped closer, his nose brushing the edge of the box before he sat back quietly, watching, as if he understood that whatever came next did not belong to him, but to Caleb alone. The rhythm that had pulsed beneath the floor did not stop, but it changed, softer. Now, less like a call and more like a presence, steady and close, as if it had moved from below the cabin into the space between them. Caleb ran his thumb along the edge of the lid, feeling the subtle indentation where it might open, his breath slow, controlled, but deeper than before, like he was preparing for something he could not yet name. Behind him, Walter remained still, his silence no longer distant, but respectful, like a man who had carried something for a long time and was finally ready to let it go. "It will not force itself open," Walter said quietly, his voice calm and certain. "It never has." Caleb glanced at him briefly, then back at the box, the words settling in his mind, not as instruction, but as understanding. This was not something to be taken, it was something to be received, and slowly, with deliberate care, he shifted his grip, pressing lightly against the lid. At first nothing happened. The metal remained still beneath his fingers, unchanged, and then the pulse came again, not from below, but from within the box itself, faint but unmistakable, and with it, a subtle release, the lid loosening just enough to move beneath his hand. Caleb paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on the seam as it shifted, then gently lifted it open. The sound was soft, almost silent, and inside there was no gold, no stacks of money, no gleam of anything that would catch the eye at first glance. Instead there were objects placed with care, each one resting as if it had been waiting, a set of worn military dog tags, their edges smoothed by years of handling, a folded letter sealed but aged, its paper yellowed at the corners, and beneath them, a small photograph, faded but intact. Caleb's breath caught slightly as he looked closer, the image showing a group of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their expressions steady, their uniforms worn but proud, and in the center of them, unmistakably, was a younger version of himself, not as he was now, but as he had been years ago, before the road, before the silence, before everything that had slowly taken pieces of him away. He stared at it, his mind searching for reason, for explanation, but finding none that made sense. Ranger shifted beside him, letting out a soft breath, as if acknowledging something Caleb could not yet fully accept, and slowly, Caleb reached for the letter, his fingers brushing against the paper, the surface dry but intact. And as he lifted it, the pulse returned again, not stronger, but clearer, like a quiet confirmation. He turned the envelope over, his eyes settling on the name written across it in steady, careful handwriting, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The cabin, the forest, the old man standing behind him. All of it fading into stillness as he read the name that had been written long before he ever stepped into that clearing. Caleb Mercer. And his breath left him slowly, not in shock, not in fear, but in something deeper, something quieter, The realization that this had not been chance, not coincidence, not even mystery, but something far more deliberate, something that had been set into motion long before he understood how to follow it. Caleb held the envelope a moment longer before opening it, his fingers steady but slower than before, as if he understood that whatever was inside would not just answer questions, but change the shape of them entirely. The paper made a soft sound as he broke the seal, the edges worn but still strong, and for a brief second, the rhythm that had filled the cabin seemed to fade into the background, not gone, but quieter. Like it was making space, Ranger shifted closer, his head resting lightly against Caleb's knee, his presence grounding, steady as always, and Caleb unfolded the letter carefully, the handwriting inside matching the name on the front, deliberate, patient, each word placed with intention rather than haste. He began to read silently at first, his eyes moving slowly across the lines, and with each sentence, something inside him began to settle, not with clarity, but with recognition. The letter did not explain everything. It did not need to. It spoke in a way that felt less like instruction and more like memory, as if it had been written for someone who already carried the answers but had forgotten where to look for them. It spoke of a time long before the cabin had fallen into silence, of a man who had built it not as a home, but as a place to keep something safe until the right hands found it. It spoke of choices made quietly, without recognition, and of the belief that some things could not be passed down through wealth, only through trust. Caleb's breath slowed as he read, the words settling deeper with each line, not because they revealed something new, but because they confirmed something he had felt since the moment he arrived, that this was not random, not accidental. It spoke of him without ever needing to explain how, of the kind of man who would stop for a stranger, who would stay without being asked, who would listen when something unseen called out. And Caleb felt a faint tightening in his chest, not pain, not even sorrow, but something quieter, something that felt like being seen in a way he had not expected. He lowered the letter slightly, his gaze drifting toward the photograph still resting in the box, the image of himself standing among others who no longer walked beside him. The memory of that time distant but not gone, and he understood then, not fully, but enough. This was not about what had been left behind. It was about what had remained, the parts of him he had carried without realizing they still mattered. Ranger let out a soft breath, his tail brushing lightly against the floor, and Caleb placed the letter back into the box with careful hands, not closing it yet, just resting it there, his fingers lingering on the edge as the rhythm returned again, steady and present, but no longer distant. It felt closer now, not beneath the floor, not within the box, but within him, and he sat there for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, simply allowing the silence to settle around him, until finally he looked up, his eyes meeting Walter's, and there was no confusion in them now, no searching, just a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained, and Walter gave a small nod, the kind that did not confirm anything new, but acknowledged what had already become true. And outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it a stillness that felt less like emptiness and more like peace, as if something that had been waiting for a very long time had finally found its way home. Caleb closed the lid of the box slowly, not to hide what was inside, but to hold it together, as if the act itself carried meaning, the metal meeting with a soft, final sound that echoed faintly through the cabin. And for a moment, everything felt still, not empty, but complete. The rhythm that had once pulsed from beneath the floor now rested quietly within him, no longer calling, no longer searching, just present, steady as breath. Ranger shifted beside him and let out a low, contented exhale, his body relaxing for the first time since they had entered the cabin, his ears no longer fixed on something unseen, but at ease, as if whatever had been waiting had finally been found. Caleb placed the box gently on the floor beside him, his hand lingering on it for a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. This was not something to carry away lightly. It was something to carry forward. He rose slowly to his feet, his movements unhurried, and turned toward Walter, the old man standing where he had been. Though something about him seemed lighter now, less burdened, like a weight he had held for years had finally been released. "You knew," Caleb said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a recognition. And Walter gave a small nod, his expression calm. "I hoped," he replied. "But knowing and hoping are not the same thing." Caleb considered that for a moment, then looked around the cabin, seeing it differently now, not as a place worn down by time, but as something that had endured it, every beam, every mark in the wood carrying a purpose, that had outlasted its maker. "Why me?" Caleb asked, the question simple, but no longer heavy, and Walter's eyes softened, just slightly. "Because you stayed," he said, and Caleb felt that answer settle deeper than any explanation could, not because it clarified everything, but because it did not need to. Outside, the light had begun to shift, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees, the air cooling as the day moved quietly toward evening. And Caleb stepped toward the door, pausing just at the threshold, the clearing stretching out before him, the road beyond still empty, still waiting, but it no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a choice. Ranger moved to his side, his presence steady, familiar, and Caleb glanced down at him briefly, a faint hint of something softer passing across his face, not quite a smile. But close, he stepped outside, the cold air brushing against his skin, the scent of pine and earth grounding him in the moment. And for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was passing through. He turned back once more, looking at the cabin, the place that had not called him loudly, but had waited quietly until he was ready to listen. Walter remained in the doorway, his figure framed by shadow and light, and he gave a final, small nod, not of farewell, but of acknowledgement, as if to say that what needed to happen had already begun. Caleb reached down and picked up the box, its weight steady in his hands, no longer unfamiliar, and as he held it, he understood something that had not been written in the letter, something that did not need to be explained. This was not an ending, not a discovery meant to be left behind. It was a beginning, quiet and unassuming, but certain, and as the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the last light of the day across the clearing, Caleb took a slow breath and stepped forward, not away from the cabin, but into whatever came next, carrying with him something that could not be measured, not in dollars, not in distance, but in the simple, enduring truth that some things are only given to those who choose to stay long enough to receive them. The road did not call to him the way it once had, its long stretch of dust and distance no longer whispering promises of escape. Instead it lay quiet beyond the clearing, as if it understood that for the first time, Caleb Mercer was not looking for somewhere else to go. He stood there for a while with the box in his hands, the late light resting across the metal surface, soft and steady, Ranger beside him, calm now, his tail moving in slow, easy arcs that matched the rhythm Caleb could still feel deep within his chest, not loud, not urgent, but present, like something that had finally found its place. Behind him, the cabin door remained open, and when Caleb turned slightly, he noticed something that made him pause. Walter Hayes was no longer standing in the doorway. There had been no sound of movement, no shift of boards or breath to mark his leaving, just an absence that felt less like disappearance and more like completion. Caleb did not call out. He did not search, because something inside him understood without needing proof. Some people do not leave the way others do. They simply finish what they were meant to stay for. He stepped back toward the cabin slowly, the boards beneath his boots familiar now, not just as wood and nails, but as something that had held a story long enough for him to arrive. He crossed the threshold again, the air inside still and steady, the space where the floor had been opened now quiet, the chamber beneath no longer pulsing, no longer calling, just resting, as if its purpose had been fulfilled. Caleb knelt once more, not to search, but to close, his hands moving with care as he replaced the board, fitting it back into place not to hide what had been there, but to honor it, the wood settling with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo with meaning rather than noise. Ranger lay down near the doorway, his head resting on his paws, watching without tension, at peace in a way that made the entire cabin feel lighter. Caleb stood again and looked around, taking in the space not as a place he had stumbled into, but as something he had been led to, every detail now carrying weight, the carved markings in the beams, the worn edges of the floor, the quiet strength of the walls, all of it speaking in a way that did not need words. He walked to the small window and looked out, the trees standing tall and still, the sky stretching wide above them. And for the first time in years, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had been returned to him that he had not realized was missing. He placed the box carefully on the table near the window, his hand resting on it for a moment as he let the quiet settle fully, not just around him, but within him, and then he moved slowly through the cabin, gathering small things without thinking, a loose nail here, a tool left out there, small acts of care that did not feel like work, but like belonging. Ranger followed him without urgency, moving in that calm, steady way that had always guided Caleb without needing direction. And as the light outside began to fade into evening, the cabin held a different kind of warmth, not from the fire, but from something less visible and far more lasting. Caleb paused near the door once more, looking out at the clearing, and this time, when he stepped forward, it was not to leave, but to begin, because some journeys do not take you farther away. They bring you exactly where you were meant to stand all along. The night settled gently over the clearing, not with darkness that pressed in, but with a quiet that seemed to expand, filling every space between the trees, the cabin windows catching the last trace of fading light before giving way to the soft glow of the fire inside. Caleb sat near the small table, the box resting in front of him, unopened now but no longer distant. It did not call to him the way it had before. It simply remained, steady and present, like something that trusted it no longer. Needed to be heard to be understood. Ranger lay stretched across the wooden floor, his breathing slow and even, one ear flicking occasionally toward the sounds outside, but without urgency, without tension, as if the world had finally settled into a rhythm that matched his own. Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap, and for a long time he did nothing. He did not reach for the box. He did not revisit the letter. He simply sat, letting the stillness unfold around him. And in that stillness, something unfamiliar began to take shape. Not a memory, not a plan, but a sense of presence, the kind that did not push forward or pull backward, but held steady in the moment. He found himself listening, not for the pulse beneath the floor, but for something else, something quieter, the sound of the fire shifting, the soft movement of Ranger's breath, the distant whisper of wind through the trees, all of it forming a kind of quiet language that did not need to be translated. And slowly, almost without noticing, Caleb realized that the weight he had carried for so long, the one he had never quite been able to name, had begun to loosen, not disappear, but settle, like something that had finally been given a place to rest. He reached forward after a while, not out of urgency, but intention, and placed his hand gently on the box again. The metal cool beneath his palm, unchanged, and yet different, because he was different now. He did not open it. He did not need to. Instead, he spoke quietly, not to anyone in the room, but to the space itself, to the unseen path that had led him here. "I understand," he said, the words simple, but complete, and for the first time, they felt true without needing explanation. Ranger lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Caleb's for a brief moment, then settling again, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying a new scent. Through the clearing, colder now, sharper, signaling the deeper night ahead. But inside the cabin, the air remained steady, held together by something that went beyond walls and wood. Caleb stood slowly, moving toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass, no longer just a man passing through, but someone who had arrived. He looked out into the darkness, the trees standing tall and silent, the road barely visible beyond them. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to follow it. He turned back into the room, his gaze moving across the space once more, the table, the fire, the place where the floor had been opened and closed again, all of it now part of something that belonged to him in a way that could not be taken or lost. And as he reached down to rest his hand briefly on Ranger's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, Caleb understood something that no letter could have fully explained. Some inheritances are not meant to be spent. They are meant to be lived, quietly, patiently, one moment at a time. Morning arrived without announcement, a quiet shift in the light that filtered through the cabin window and settled gently across the wooden floor, tracing the edges of everything Caleb had begun to recognize as his own, not through ownership, but through presence. Ranger was already awake, sitting near the doorway with his ears relaxed and his gaze turned outward, watching the clearing as if it had always belonged to his routine. Caleb stepped outside slowly, the cool air meeting him with a clarity that felt different now, no longer sharp or distant, but grounding. The trees stood tall and still, their branches catching the early sunlight in a way that made the entire forest seem awake without needing to move. He took a few steps forward, boots pressing into the frost-softened earth, and paused just beyond the cabin. Looking out toward the road that had brought him there, it was still there, unchanged, stretching out into distance, offering the same quiet promise it always had. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer saw it as a path to follow, but as something he could leave behind without losing anything. Ranger moved beside him, brushing lightly against his leg before continuing a few steps ahead, then stopping, turning back just enough to make sure Caleb was still there, and Caleb gave a small nod, not as a command, but as an acknowledgement. He was not going anywhere, not today, not for a while. He turned back toward the cabin, the structure standing steady against the backdrop of trees, no longer worn in the way he first saw it, but enduring, like something that had outlasted its purpose only to find a new one. He stepped inside again, the warmth of the fire still lingering faintly in the air, the table near the window holding the box exactly where he had left it, untouched, unhidden, waiting without urgency. Caleb walked over and rested his hand on it once more, not to open it, not to confirm what was already known, but simply to feel its presence, steady and quiet, like the rhythm that had once called to him and now lived somewhere deeper, somewhere that did not need sound to exist. He moved through the cabin with slow intention, checking the roof where he had worked the day before, reinforcing a beam that had shifted, adjusting small things that needed care, not because they demanded it, but because he chose to give it, each action simple, grounded, and real. Ranger followed in his usual way, calm and observant, settling near the doorway again. When Caleb finished, watching the world beyond without tension, as if he understood that this place no longer held questions, only answers waiting to be lived, the hours passed without urgency, the sun rising higher, light filling the cabin in quiet waves, and Caleb found himself moving with a sense of purpose that did not feel forced. It did not come from plans or expectations, but from something quieter, something steady. The kind of purpose that does not ask where it leads, only that it is followed. He stepped outside once more as the day opened fully, the forest alive in its stillness, the air carrying the scent of pine and something new, something beginning. And as he stood there, not searching, not leaving, simply being, Caleb understood what had been given to him, not wealth, not answers, but something far more lasting, a place to remain, a reason to stay, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the greatest things we receive are not meant to be carried away, but to be lived, where we find them, one steady breath at a time.